Hi, my name's Peninnah Taylor, and I was raised in a secular Jewish household. Now, what that means is that what Judaism meant to me was it explained why I had a big nose, why I talked with my hands, and why I liked Chinese food. But other than that, my Judaism had absolutely no meaning to me. It was something ancient and archaic, something to be remembered maybe, but certainly nothing to be desired. And it was within that context that I grew up. Now, I had a traumatic childhood. My parents were divorced when I was 4 years old. I suffered a tremendous amount of abuse at the hands of a friend of our family. And by the time I got to high school, I started to ask a lot of existential questions. I started to ask, if life is so painful and so difficult, and there's nothing out there greater and more meaningful than all of this pain, then what's the point? And as I started to ask these questions, one of my classmates came up to me and she said, Peninnah, your questions are no different from that of any other typical American high school student. We all have these questions. She said, but there's an answer to your questions. There's a solution to your dilemma. She said, what you need is to have a relationship with God. Now, I had been raised, like I told you, in a secular Jewish home, but my paternal grandparents had arranged for me to attend an Orthodox Hebrew day school for a couple of years during 4th and 5th grade because they wanted me to know something about being Jewish. Now, when I started Hebrew school, there was a problem because I very quickly learned that what happened at home needed to stay at home and what happened at school needed to stay at school. My first day of Hebrew school, I learned about something called Shabbat, and I was so excited about this thing called Shabbat, and I came running home to tell my mom about Shabbat. And you know what my mother said to me? She said, "Don't tell me how to run my life." A little while later, I was sitting in school one day and all of my friends were talking about the amazing things that they had done over the weekend. And I was so excited because I was being raised by a single mom and we hardly ever got to do anything. But this particular weekend, my mom had managed to take my sister and I to an amusement park. And I was really excited. So as my friends started talking about what they had done, I began to share about how I had gone to this amusement park on Saturday. Well, my teacher caught wind of what I said, pulled me out of the classroom, and said, "Stop being so chutzpahdik." I didn't even know what the word meant. I thought maybe it was some kind of a contagious disease or something, but clearly it was something that I didn't want to be. And so I very quickly learned that what happens at home stays at home, and what happens at school stays at school. Well, now here I am all these years in the future, and this classmate of mine is telling me that what I need is to have a relationship with God. And I thought to myself, what she says really sounds true. And so at the age of almost 16, I was introduced to God and to Jesus. You see, my friend told me that what I needed was to have this relationship with God. And so I embraced Christianity. In fact, my newfound faith gave me the strength to make all sorts of changes in my life. I stopped doing drugs. I started to hang out with a good crowd of kids at school. I actually started to attend school. I stopped drinking. I stopped smoking. And my mother was watching. Remember, she had watched me slowly slip away, and now she was watching as all these incredible things started to change in my life. And I became really a brand new person. Well, my mother was thinking about those things when one day I came to her and I began to share my new faith with her, as all good Christians are wont to do. And my mother thought to herself, wow, if something could have this much of an impact on my daughter's life, it must be the truth. And so I brought my mother and my sister to Christianity as well. Well, shortly after that, I graduated high school. I went on to Bible college. I got a certificate in evangelism explosion. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. And I started to date a young man who was my best friend's older brother. Well, it turns out he had also been to Bible college and he was a pastor. And he and I began to get serious. And after a while started to talk about this thing called marriage. And at the time, I didn't think of it as intermarriage because we both believed the same thing. And the idea of me being Jewish and him being not was not something that even entered onto my radar. And so as Paul and I began to get serious, we started to talk about marriage. And I started to think, it would be an amazing thing if my father would walk me down the aisle when I got married. But how is my father going to do that? We don't even have a relationship. In fact, I hadn't seen him but one time in 15 years. How was he going to walk me down the aisle when I got married? So I went to my mom and I asked my mom if it would be okay to write a letter to my dad, inviting him to come visit us for a couple of weeks. At this point, we were living in Florida and my father was living in New Jersey. To my surprise, my mom said sure. And so I wrote a letter. This was back in the days before the internet and, messaging and email and all of that. And I wrote a letter to my dad and my mom sent it to my dad. And my dad said that he would love to come and visit us and get to know us better. So we made the arrangements and my dad came to visit us. He spent 2 weeks with us. And while he was there getting to know us better, he also got to know my mom again. And he decided that he was falling back in love with my mom. So one day he asked my mom, I'm falling back in love with you, and I would really love to remarry you and spend the rest of my life with you. What do you think? And my mom said, I'm also falling back in love with you, but we've got a problem, she said, because I'm a born-again Christian and you are a secular Jew. It's not going to work. We can't get married. And I said, wait a minute, hang on a second. I know how to solve this problem. I've got a certificate in evangelism. I know how to get people to become Christians. So I went to the Bible bookstore and I bought a Christian Bible and I began to share with my dad from the Christian Bible. I took him to church and wouldn't you know it, my dad became a Christian too. Well, then my mom and my dad were able to get remarried and they did remarry after being divorced for 15 years. And 7 months later, when I married Paul, my father walked me down the aisle. Well, Paul was now enlisted in the United States Air Force, and we ended up getting stationed in England. So we went over to England, and while we were there, one day I was praying, and I began to get this very strange feeling like God was telling me to start lighting candles on Friday night. And I thought to myself, wow, this is like really strange. I'm not exactly sure where this is coming from. I mean, I knew that Jewish women lit candles on Friday night, but my mother didn't light candles and my grandmother didn't light candles. And I'm sure my great-grandmother, my bubby, did light candles, but I never saw her. I had no clue, but I really felt like God was telling me to light candles on Friday night. And so I went to my husband and I said, I feel like God is telling me to light candles on Friday night. What do you think I should do? And my husband said to me, well, if you believe that this is what God wants you to do in your service to him, then go ahead. And so I thought for a minute. I was like, okay, where do I start? Well, I remembered that I had inherited my great-grandmother's candlesticks, so I went over the buffet and I opened the drawer and I took out the candlesticks. And next to the candlesticks was a Maxwell House Passover Haggadah. I don't know if you're old enough to remember the Maxwell House Passover Haggadahs, but Maxwell House is a coffee company, and every year when they put out their Kosher for Passover line of coffee, they would often give away, if somebody bought, I guess, 2 jars or something, they would often give away these Haggadahs that they had printed. And when I was growing up, remember I told you I was raised in a secular home, but we did do one Jewish thing each year, and that was Passover. Of course, our Passover didn't look like what most Jewish people would recognize as a Passover Seder. Perhaps you can identify with this. But this is what our Passover Seder looked like. We would come over to my grandparents' house, and my great-grandmother would greet us with a good yontif. I didn't know what that meant either, but that's what Bubby would say. And we'd walk in and we'd sit down, and my grandfather would bring out this stack of Passover Haggadahs that he had collected over the years, and he would pass them out, and he would tell us to turn to page 25 or something like that, and we'd all open up the Haggadahs and we'd turn to page 25, and he would read a paragraph from the Haggadah. Then we would sing the chorus to Dayenu, and we would eat. Now, of course, we had matzah because it was Passover after all, but we also had a lot of other things that you would not consider kosher for Passover. Nonetheless, this is what we did every year, and I had a fond family memory of doing Passover. So when I got married, I asked my grandmother if it would be okay for me to take one of these Haggadahs with me, and of course she said yes. Now, what does this have to do with lighting candles? Well, it turns out that inside the front cover of the Haggadah was the blessing for lighting candles, because Jewish women light candles at the beginning of every holiday, not just Shabbat, but sometimes Passover begins on Friday, right? And so not only did the Haggadah have the words for lighting the holiday candles, but it also had a line of what to say when the holiday begins on a Friday night. Thank God for Maxwell House and the fact that the bracha, that the prayer was transliterated, which means it wasn't just in Hebrew and in English, but it was in Hebrew and English letters. I began to use this and to light candles on Friday night. Meanwhile, I'm still going to church on Sunday. Sometime later, my husband gets all excited and he comes running down the stairs and he says to me, Peninnah, Peninnah. Of course, that's not what he called me, but he says, Peninnah, I was reading in the Old Testament. You have to understand, the Old Testament is what the non-Jewish people call our Hebrew scriptures, our Tanakh, our Jewish Bible. They call it the Old Testament. And he says, I was reading in the Old Testament and I came across a verse that says that there are certain things that God asked the Jewish people to do forever. He said, and if forever really means forever, and I'm to be right before God, then my Jewish wife and my Jewish children need to do these things too. Now you have to understand something. Sometimes when people hear my story, which condensed into a 45-minute talk or even a 20-minute talk cannot possibly give all of the details, they think, wow, Peninnah, you were kind of like all over the map religiously. And the truth is, if you step back and you look at the story, what you really see is a progression of two people on a journey to discover truth. All we wanted was to serve God in truth. At the time, we didn't understand that that did not include Christianity. But I wanted to serve God in truth. And so when my husband told me that there was something that God wanted me to do, I said, go ahead, shoot. He said, well, it says in the Old Testament that God told the Jewish people that they are not supposed to eat pork or shellfish. I stopped for a second. And I said, wait a minute, let me get this straight. No more ham and cheese sandwiches? He said, I had to think about it for a minute, but I decided that if this is what God wanted me to do, then this was what I was going to do. And so I stopped eating pork and shellfish. So here I am, I'm lighting candles on Friday night. I'm not eating pork or shellfish, and I'm going to church on Sunday. Well, a little while later, I'm reading in the Christian part of the Christian Bible, which is called the New Testament, and I come across a verse that talks about head coverings. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, it was very confusing too. Oh, I wasn't sure if the verse was saying that women should cover their heads and men shouldn't cover their heads, or men should cover their heads and women shouldn't cover their heads. So we decided to call in the pastor of our church, who was not my husband at the time, and to ask him the question, you know, what is this talking about? Because our pastor happened to be a Greek scholar, and the New Testament is written in the Greek language. So the pastor comes in and he sits down and he says, well, now, I have to tell you, this passage is very difficult to understand in the original Greek. He said, because it's not so clear. It's a very complicated passage. I said, yeah, I know, but that's why we called you. He said, no, really, it's not very clear which word's modifying which word and what it is that Paul, the author of this passage, really means. I said, well, okay, Pastor, what do you think it means? He said, well, what I think it means is that married women should cover their head when they're in prayer. He said, but I can't teach that because women nowadays, they don't want to hear it. Now, if you're a person who's seeking the truth, the argument that women today don't want to hear it is no reason for you not to do something if you believe it to be right, right? And so I decided, along with my husband, that I would start covering my head. Now, at first, I got a hat. And see, the problem is that I have a little bit of attention deficit, and I found that I would put my hat on, and when I wanted to talk to God, talking to God is prayer, right? That's what prayer is. It's talking to God, right? So when I wanted to talk to God, I would put the hat on and I would talk to God. And then when I was done, I would take off the hat and I would go and I would put it down somewhere. The problem is that the next time I wanted to talk to God, I would have to, hang on a second there, big guy, wait a second, and I'd have to go find the hat. And so I decided there had to be a better solution. So I decided what I would do is I would wear a scarf, because a scarf I could drape around my neck and I could wear it like that all day. And then when I wanted to talk to God, I would put the scarf on. But what I discovered was that I talked to God throughout the course of the day. Now, I could give you some silly examples of times that we talk to God, when we say, oh, God, please help me, or please stop the children from screaming, or whatever. But silly examples, but prayer is talking to God. And so I found that I prayed throughout the course of the day. So on went the scarf, and off went the scarf, and on went the scarf, and off went the scarf. And finally, I just said, forget it. And I started to wear the scarf all the time. So now here I am. I'm lighting candles on Friday night. I'm not eating pork or shellfish. And I'm covering my head all the time. And I'm still going to church on Sunday. But something began to happen inside of me. Back then, I couldn't have told you what it was, but looking at it now, I call it my spiritual identity crisis, because I believe that my Jewish neshama, my Jewish soul, began to be at war with my Christian beliefs. And this restlessness that was going on inside of me was something that I could not make heads or tails of. In fact, I firmly believe that when a Jewish person begins to take on mitzvot, a mitzvah, even if they don't realize that that's what they're doing, it opens a conduit for their soul, their Jewish neshama, to communicate with God. And as my soul began to communicate with God, I began to have this restlessness inside of me. While we were in England, my parents decided to come visit us. Now, last I had left my parents, they were attending a nice little Assembly of God church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And they came to visit because I was about to have a child, and I'm helping my mom unpack her suitcase. And one of her suitcases is filled with all sorts of Judaica items: shofars, tzitzit, kippot, sitters, you name it. And I turned to my mom and I said, Mom, what's with the Jewish stuff? And she said, well, while we were in Pittsburgh, we discovered a group of Jewish people who were born Jewish, who had become Christians and had found a way to synthesize their Jewish heritage with their Christian beliefs. And they called themselves Messianic Jews. Now, I had never heard of Messianic Jews before, but I had heard of Jews for Jesus. And I thought to myself, maybe that's the solution to what's going on inside of me. Maybe we need to seek out one of these Messianic congregations. And so when we came back to the United States a year later, we sought out one of these Messianic congregations. Now, throughout our history, because of our training and our background and our personalities, my husband and I had been serving in lay leadership in the churches that we had been, every church that we had been involved in from the time that we got married and beyond, and up until this point. So we started to get involved in this Messianic congregation. We were now in Maryland, which is where my parents lived. My husband got stationed there. And we were attending a Messianic congregation, but it was a long drive from our house. And one day my father says to my husband and I, maybe we should start a Messianic congregation of our own. After all, the closest one is so far away, and we've got some unique beliefs of our own. And maybe we should, Paul is trained as a pastor, and Peninnah plays the guitar. I sing and I led worship and led prayer, and he said, and your mother and I are very visionary and very administrative, so the four of us would make a great team. What do you think? And so my husband and I went and we prayed about it, and we decided that this was what God wanted us to do. So we started a Messianic congregation with my parents. But at the time I thought to myself, if we're going to be doing something we're calling Jewish, because Messianic Jewish, maybe we should know a little something about Judaism, don't you think? So I went to the Jewish bookstore to find a book on Judaism. Of course, it turns out that there's a lot of books on Judaism at the Jewish bookstore, but I found one book that really caught my attention. It was a book called How to Run a Traditional Jewish Household. Now, the book was written by an Orthodox woman, a very modern Orthodox woman named Blue Greenberg, and in the book, instead of using the term Orthodox, she preferred to use the phrase Torah observant. And I thought to myself, wow, I like the sound of that, Torah observant. Maybe that's what we need to be. Maybe we need to be Torah observant Messianic Jews. And so I went back to the bookstore and I got books on keeping kosher. I got out Art Scroll's big book on keeping kosher. I got out the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is the condensed code of Jewish law, in English, of course. Read through that several times. I went back, and I have some funny stories about that too, but I went back and I got books on the laws of family purity, how to keep Shabbat, how to keep kosher, you name it. Anything that you could learn about being an Orthodox Jew from a book, I learned. Of course, you can't learn everything there is to learn about being an Orthodox Jew from a book, but everything that you could, I did. Devoured the books and began to make changes in our lives. In fact, now not only was I covering my head, but I was dressing modestly, and my non-Jewish husband, but my Jewish children, my boys, were all wearing a kippah and tzitzit, and if you had run into my family on the street, you would have thought we were an Orthodox Jewish couple, just like any Orthodox Jewish couple in Borough Park or Lakewood or Jerusalem. You would not have known that we were also Christians. Well, we went on to lead this congregation with my parents for several years, but as you can imagine, sometimes when you're in a joint program with your parents, it can be a little bit tense, a little bit stressful, and so we decided that as we were starting to feel a little burned out, that we valued our relationship with my parents more than we valued our position in the congregation, and we decided to leave. Now, my parents kept the congregation going for several more years, but my husband and I went to one of the Messianic congregations in the area. Now, we lived in the Washington, D.C. area, and we were attending a Messianic congregation in Northern Virginia, which is just south of that area. But one day there was an event at the Messianic congregation in Baltimore, which is north of Washington, D.C. And while we were there, after the event, there was food, because let's face it, you have Jews plus an event, you have what? Food, right? Doesn't matter what the Jews believe or even if they're Christians. If you have Jews and you have an event, you're going to have food. So afterwards, we're standing around at the event, and there's this really nice, lovely, blonde-haired lady who's trying to convince me that the food is kosher, because she can tell by looking at me that that's something that might be important to me. And she stops mid-sentence, and she says to me, "How would you like to buy a nice big 5-bedroom house in Upper Park Heights in Baltimore?" She says, "In fact, I believe that God wants you to buy this house." Now, to a lot of listeners, that sounds totally crazy, but I was used to Christians speaking this way because Christians do speak this way frequently. But I thought this woman was just a few French fries short of a Happy Meal, if you know what I mean. And I'm not one for confrontation, so I had to figure out, how do I get out of this conversation? I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to blame it on my husband, because I figured what would happen is I'd go back to my husband and I'd tell him what this woman said, and he'd say, "What, are you crazy? We're not headed to Baltimore, we're headed to Virginia." That would be the end of the discussion, and then I would be able to break free from this lady. So I said, hang on, I have to ask my husband. So I went over and I asked my husband, I told him about the lady's offer. I said, she even offered to hold the mortgage for us so she'd be the bank. And instead of telling me I was crazy, which was what it said in the script, what he was supposed to say to me, he says to me, "Well, we could take a look at it." I have it on good authority that that was the first and last time I was ever speechless. But after picking myself up from shock, I went over to the lady and I said to her, "My husband says that we can take a look at it." So we made an appointment and we went and we looked at the house. Now, as it turns out, we totally fell in love with the house because, first of all, it was 3 times the size of the house we were currently living in that I was homeschooling my 4 children in, and the walls were beginning to close in on me. This was a big house, and it had a lot of character, and we fell in love with it. But something even more remarkable than that, when we drove up to the house in this Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Baltimore, something inside of me, very similar to that voice many years before, and I promise you, I'm not schizophrenic, really, but this voice inside of me said, "You're home." Now, I'm not sure what that was either. It may have simply been being in a place in such close proximity to other Jewish souls, but I suddenly felt like this was home, and we fell in love with the house. So we did then what any good Christian couple or Messianic couple would do in our situation. We went back to our congregation and we asked them to pray for us concerning whether or not it was God's will that we should buy this house. They even had a special prayer meeting for the purpose. And wouldn't you know it, all 250 members of the congregation unanimously agreed that it was God's will that we buy this house. Why? Because who better to convert Orthodox Jews to Messianic Judaism than Messianic Jews who look and act like Orthodox Jews, right? And so with the blessing of our congregation, we made arrangements and we bought the house. Now, something that we didn't find out about until many years later was that this nice blonde Jewish woman who wasn't Jewish, that we knew, when she had bought the house 3 years before, she had taken it upon herself to go knocking door to door to inform all of the Orthodox Jewish neighbors, and they were all Orthodox in that neighborhood, that they were hopelessly lost and going to burn in hell because they didn't believe in Christianity. So you can imagine how they felt about her. And then when she told them that she had sold the house, you can imagine how ecstatic they were until she told them that she was selling it to a nice Messianic family. I mean, in America and other countries in the West, we know how to live next door to non-Jews. That happens all the time. But how do you live next door to somebody whose sole purpose, pun intended, is to convert you and your children to some form of Christianity? And so when we moved in, we had kind of a difficult beginning. It wasn't that our neighbors meant to be rude, they just didn't know what to do with us. Well, anyway, we moved in and we settled in and we started to think, we've got a problem because the Messianic congregation is not within walking distance of our house. And if we get in our car and we drive on Shabbat, nobody's going to listen to a thing we have to say. So what are we going to do about it? Well, what we decided to do was we were going to, on Shabbat, attend one of the more than a dozen Orthodox synagogues that were in our neighborhood. And during the week, we would go to the Messianic congregation to get our fill of Christianity and to have a Bible study. So what congregation, what shul, what synagogue do we go to? Well, it turns out that the rabbi who ran the bookstore that I had gone to get all of these books about Judaism also happened to be a congregational rabbi in the neighborhood. So we decided that that's where we would go. So our first Shabbat, we went to this congregation, we went to this synagogue, and we had the most amazing experience. Everybody there was delightful. They were so helpful. They helped me to know where we were in the prayer. They helped me to know where we were in the Torah reading. In fact, it's funny because sometimes you hear these Baal Tshuva stories of people who have returned, and their first experience in the synagogue wasn't necessarily so wonderful, but ours was amazing. Everybody was wonderful, and they were so helpful and so kind and so sweet. Well, what happens on the other side of the mechitza in the men's section when there's a new guy in town? He gets called to the Torah, right? So my husband, who was wearing a kippah and tzitzit and a talit, and he had a sitter, he looked like he was praying, he was offered an aliyah to the Torah, to go up and to make a blessing over the reading of the Torah. But my husband is a man of tremendous integrity, and he told them, I'm not Jewish. Now, this is an important part of the story because there's a lot of people who are not aware of a phenomenon that's going on out in the world. And that is there are Messianic congregations all over the world, really, but especially prevalent in the United States, although unfortunately is also growing here in Israel. So in these Messianic congregations, there are non-Jews, and that's fine. They can go wherever they want, right? But they're learning not only how to act and look like an Orthodox Jew, they're learning how to make the blessings on being called up to the Torah. In fact, some of them are learning how to read from the Torah. And then they go and they visit the Kotel in Jerusalem or other Orthodox synagogues, and they're counted in a minyan. And when they're given an aliyah, when they're called up to the Torah, they make up a fake Hebrew name so that no one is the wiser. And what they're doing is they're committing a crime against the Jewish people. Now, some people say, Peninnah, wow, that's really a harsh thing to say. And I agree, but at the very least, what they're doing is not the truth, and it's not right. It's not okay. But my husband's not like that. My husband is a man of tremendous integrity. And so when he was given an aliyah to the Torah, he said, I'm not Jewish. Well, shortly thereafter, my husband and I were having a conversation one day, and he said, we really need to tell the rabbi what we believe, because at some point it's going to come out, and we don't want him to feel betrayed and feel that we've been lying to him. And I said to my husband, I'm not so sure about this. I cannot see this ending well. But my husband, again, a man of tremendous integrity, insisted, and I relented, and we invited the rabbi to come to our house. Now, he knew, because of what had happened in the synagogue, that my husband wasn't Jewish, and that I was, and so therefore the children were. So what do you think he thought we were inviting him to come talk to us about? Conversion, right? Right. Well, he comes in, and my husband begins to tell him what he believes. And after a minute or two, the rabbi stops him, and he says, well, wait a minute. You don't believe that anymore, do you? To which my husband said, yeah. Well, in the moment it took for absolute shock to register on the rabbi's face, I began to see my world implode. I mean, if he kicked us out of the synagogue, what were we going to do? I was homeschooling my kids. If they're not allowed to play with the kids on the street, and, who are they going to play with? And what if they take our pictures and put them on posters and post them on lampposts going down the street saying, warning, missionary threat? Maybe my kids will get beaten up. I don't know what's going to happen. And I started to cry. Well, the rabbi looked at me and he said to me, what do you believe? Now, I'm here to tell you that at this point in my story, I have been a Christian for 17 years. I have been responsible for converting hundreds, if not thousands, of people to Christianity. Now, granted, only a small percentage of them were Jewish, but still, I knew exactly what I believed. But in that moment of emotionality, when the rabbi said to me, what do you believe? And I saw my whole world implode, all I could do was cry and say, Rabbi, I don't know what I believe. And I said, please, please don't kick us out of the shul. Don't kick us out of the synagogue. I don't know what we'll do. The rabbi sat there for the longest time saying absolutely nothing at all. In fact, I didn't think he was ever going to say anything again. But after a while, he turned to me and he said to me the most important words that anyone has said to me anywhere along my spiritual journey, my Jewish journey. He said to me, you are a Jew no matter what you believe, even though what you believe is not Judaism. He said, let me be clear on this. It's not Judaism. It's not kosher. It's not okay. But you as a Jewish woman are responsible before God to fulfill the mitzvot, to carry out the commandments that God has given the Jewish people. And therefore, I'm going to allow you and the children to continue to come to the synagogue. He did ask for a little while that my husband not come because he didn't know what to do with him. He said, but there's one caveat. He said, I want you to talk to a guy from an organization called Jews for Judaism. Now, I had never heard of Jews for Judaism before, but I'm not stupid. Jews for Judaism, Jews for Jesus. They probably don't like people like me very much. But what was I supposed to do? I mean, if I wanted to keep coming to the synagogue, it was pretty clear that I was going to have to talk to this guy from Jews for Judaism. So I reluctantly agreed, but I figured, the rabbi would forget after a little while, and I'd be able to put him off, and we'd just be able to carry out the status quo for a while. Well, I was wrong. He didn't read the script either. I don't know what it is with guys and not reading the script, but anyway, he didn't forget. And he kept calling me and saying, Peninnah, have you talked to this guy from Jews for Judaism yet? Have you talked to this guy from Jews for Judaism? And I was saying, not yet, but eventually he made it pretty clear that if I didn't call the guy from Jews for Judaism, that things might change. And so I picked up the phone and I called Jews for Judaism, and the director then of the Baltimore office of Jews for Judaism, named Mark, came over to our house one evening. Mark came into the house and he turns to me and he says, so let's talk about why you think he's the Jewish Messiah. And I turned to him and I thought to myself, what, you start every conversation this way? Anyway, he came in and he sat down, and my husband was perfectly glad to start the talking, and I was perfectly glad to let him start talking. And so he threw out a verse. And Mark said, well, let's take a look at that. And so Mark took out a Bible and he opened it to the chapter of the book of Isaiah, where the passage that my husband had quoted comes from. And then he turned to me and he said to me, Peninnah, have you ever read this verse in its context before? And I said, of course I have. I read my Bible every year from cover to cover. Now, I don't know if you know this, but most evangelical Christians make it their habit to read through their Bible, 3/4 of which includes our Tanakh. They call it the Old Testament. They've taken the books and changed the order, and they've retranslated certain passages to say what they needed to say in order to prove what they believe. But for the most part, it's still our Tanakh, our Jewish Bible, and they've combined it with the New Testament in order to make the Christian Bible. So he said to me, when you read through the Tanakh, through the Old Testament, you see the Messiah in every page, right? And I said, of course, it's all about him. He said, I want you to do me a favor. We're going to read through this, the entire chapter, and I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the people who existed at the time that the prophet Isaiah was writing this book, which was 700 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, 700 years before Christianity ever existed. He said, can you do that for me? And I said, sure, I can do that. And so we read through this chapter in its context, and guess what I discovered? I discovered that it's not about him at all. It's not about Christianity. It's not even a messianic passage. And when we went back and we looked at that particular verse in the original Hebrew, what I discovered was in order for it to say what Christianity says it says, they have to mistranslate and take out of context this verse. So we only touched on one other corollary issue during the time that Mark was with us, and he left at my house. He wasn't even there that long, but he left me with an awful lot to chew on. If this core belief that I had held for 17 years was based on a lie, what else did I believe was based on a lie? And over the course of the next few weeks, I kept going back to the office over and over again, asking him, what about this verse? And what about this verse? And Mark would say, okay, well, let's take a look at it. And, I didn't take his word for it either. I went back to my friends, to my Christian friends, and to all kinds of stuff online. And I said to them, I said, now, we always believed that this says this, and Judaism says that it means this, and how do you reconcile the two? And I found out something very interesting. There's a verse in the book of Proverbs that says that the first person to make a case seems right until another comes and argues against him. And I discovered that Christianity was banking on the fact that Judaism would not have an answer to their claims for the Messiah. And so one by one, as I began exploring these verses, the bricks of the foundation of my faith began to be pulled out. Eventually, there was so little there that the entire structure collapsed. And I was faced with the daunting task of trying to figure out what it is that I actually believe. I mean, if everything that I have believed for the last 17 years was a lie, did I still believe in God? And if I did still believe in God, what did that mean? Well, was the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, still the word of God to the Jewish people? And if it was, what did that mean for me as a Jewish woman? Do I have to be Orthodox, or can I be something else? Well, since I'm standing here talking to you today, I'm sure that you can figure out what my conclusions were. I decided to convert to Buddhism. No, I'm just joking. No, I realized that Torah, true Judaism, was the truth. And so I came back to Judaism. I embraced the Judaism that I never knew of my forefathers. But now I had a problem, because at this point in my life, I was married to a man, a Christian man. He was not Jewish. And I had 4 children who were 6, 8, 10, and 12 years old. And they also believed in Christianity, as did my parents. And so I began to think, well, my son, who's 12, is supposed to be bar mitzvahed in less than a year. And I know that the community is not going to bar mitzvah him if he still believes in Christianity. So what am I going to do? I began to share with my son the verses that I was coming across, the things that I was learning. And I began to share with him, and I said to him, I want you to take a look at this. This is what we always understood this verse to mean. This is what Judaism says it means. And I want you to decide for yourself, because obviously the best way to get a preteen or a teenager to believe what you want them to believe is not by shoving it down their throat, right? So I began to share with him, and I said, I want you to decide who's telling the truth. Well, long story short, my son, of his own accord, decided to embrace Judaism. And my daughter, who was 10 years old, was standing around watching as this was happening, and she decided that Judaism was the truth as well. Now, my other two boys, who were 6 and 8 years old, well, you know how 6 and 8-year-olds are, right? They believe whatever their mommy and daddy tell them. So they're like, oh, we don't pray to him anymore? Okay. Well, anyway, you may be wondering how I'm getting away with sharing all of this with my children when my husband is still a Christian. Well, it turns out that he had asked some of the pastors that were involved in our lives what he should do, because now I'm teaching the kids that what we've always taught them wasn't the truth. And the pastor, who was a very smart man, said to him, look, let her be. He said, one of two things are going to happen. He said, either this is going to be a passing fad and it will all be over before you know it. He said, or when the children get older, you'll be able to talk to them again about Christianity. He said, but if the two of you are arguing about God with the children are going to end up believing nothing at all. You want them to at least have a faith in God, right? So he backed off and he let me do this, and I began to speak to my children, and all 4 of them came to Judaism. Meanwhile, I'm sharing with my father about the verses that I'm coming across, and my father's decided that he's going to take it upon himself to totally prove the Jewish view is wrong. The only problem is, it isn't. And as he took each verse and he went back into the writings and he was trying to prove that Judaism could not be right and that Christianity was the truth, one by one, all of his Christian beliefs began to fall apart. And slowly, the members of the congregation began to drop off. So here we are, 9 months later, we're at my son's bar mitzvah. We had a backyard barbecue because it was the easiest way to allow the most amount of people to be able to join us. And while we're at the barbecue, I look out the back window and my dad is talking to Mark. Now, we invited Mark because he had had such a big part in our life, even though my husband was still a Christian at the time. Meanwhile, I'm looking out the window and I see my dad talking to Mark. A couple of hours later, I go out the window again to look and see what's going on, and I see that my father is still talking to Mark. You see, over the course of the previous year, I had given him a lot of explanations and arguments, but he still had some questions. And so Mark clarified those questions for him. And by the end of the bar mitzvah party, my father and my mother had decided to come back to Judaism as well. Well, it wasn't so easy for my husband because, let's face it, he was born and raised a Christian. And unlike so many of the conversion stories that we hear where Christians will say, but I always doubted this, or I never quite believed that, or this never sat right with me, whatever. My husband was a true believer. He had no questions until I went and pulled the carpet out from under our entire life. And so over the next few years, life was very difficult. In fact, my marriage, which up until that point had been the most amazing marriage, we never ever fought. Sometimes we just disagreed because if not, that would be kind of weird. But we never argued. We never fought with each other. And now everything that I said offended him and everything he said offended me. And we were fighting all the time. And the children were convinced we were going to end up divorced, not because of the difference in our faith, but because of all of the fighting all of the time. And so 2 years after I had come back to Judaism, one day my husband and I are having one of our typical arguments, and he said something that made me very angry. And so I just went, oh, you just say that because you're a Christian. And he looked at me and he said, well, actually, the truth is, I'm not a Christian anymore. I said, what? He said, no, really, over the course of the last 2 years, you've given me enough reasons to doubt the validity of the New Testament. I no longer believe in Christianity. He said, I'm not a Christian anymore, but I'm not ready to convert to Judaism because I'm not convinced that Judaism is the truth with a capital T. He said, and I don't want to trade one flawed religion for another. So over the course of the next 2 years, we began to study together because now he was what we call a ben Noach or a Noachide. He was a non-Jew who believes in the God of Israel. He wasn't sure what else he believed, but he didn't believe in any of Christianity, and he was just serving God. And so he was much more accepted into the community, and we began to take courses together, and he began to take a lot of the classes that people who are studying for conversion will take. After an additional 2 years, so 4 years after I came back to Judaism, My husband one day said, you know, instead of asking what Judaism has to offer me, I really need to start exploring why it is that God gave me a Jewish wife and Jewish children. Clearly, God gave me a Jewish wife and Jewish children for a reason, and I need to find out what that is. And so he began to study in earnest, and 4.5 years after I came back to Judaism, my husband decided that Judaism was the truth with a capital T, and he converted to Judaism, and we were married together under the chuppah at the Etz Chaim Center in Baltimore, along with our entire community and our children. And now we were a complete Jewish family. Paul Michael Taylor became Pinchas Moshe, and we were a whole family together. After that, I went to Jews for Judaism, and I said to them, you know, I've been speaking since I was 16 years old. I'm trained in evangelism, which is not that different from outreach, I don't suppose. And I said, and I have a personal tikkun to make. I have a fix, a repair, because I've been responsible for converting hundreds, maybe thousands of people to Christianity. And I want to spend the rest of my life helping Jewish people who have gotten trapped in that to come back to Judaism. But more than that, I want to inspire Jewish people to have a meaningful, relevant, and deep relationship with God within the context of Judaism, so that when they seek spirituality, as all of us do at some point in our lives, they won't feel the need to look beyond Judaism, but will choose to get more involved with their Judaism. And so Jews for Judaism agreed to take me on, and I began to work for them until a year and a half later when we made Aliyah to Israel, and I started my own organization, and I began speaking all over the world, sharing my story. But one of the things that I decided was that more important than sharing with people why we don't believe these other beliefs is helping to strengthen and to build up the Jewish souls, the Jewish neshamas, so that, as I said before, they will have a deep and meaningful and relevant relationship with God within the context of Judaism. And so I began to share the insights that I have gleaned over the past many years of my life. And now I talk about, I teach on the Parsha, but I also talk about how to know that God loves you, and if he loves us, then why do bad things happen? Why are we so afraid of the word God, right? And different things that, different issues that people bring up within Judaism. Because what I hope to do is to be able to inspire people to have a deep, meaningful, and relevant relationship with God within the context of Judaism. If anybody would like to contact me, I'm available at Peninnah Taylor, PENINATAYLOR @gmail.com. You can visit my website at peninnataylor.com. And if you're interested in booking me for a speaking engagement, you can also contact me through the website. Thank you so much.
All English lectures are available online at hidabrut.com.